I never believed in ghosts. Not really. I've always been a logical one, the kind of person who looks for a reasonable explanation behind every bump in the night. That was, of course, until I spent 3 weeks in that house. Even now, telling this story makes my stomach churn. It all started with a plan. The idea was simple: buy an old house, fix it up, and sell it for a profit. When the ad for the Victorian mansion on Blackthorn Hill popped up, it seemed like fate. The price was unbelievably low, but I didn't think much of it. Maybe the owners just wanted it gone. The first time I saw the house, I couldn't deny its eerie charm. It stood at the top of a hill, surrounded by towering pines that blocked out most of the sunlight. The air was colder up there, and the house itself seemed to loom over everything, watching. The house was massive, with intricate woodwork, stained glass windows, and a spiral staircase that led to an attic we hadn't yet explored. It was beautiful in a sad, broken way, like it had been waiting for someone to bring it back to life. The first few days were exhausting. I threw myself into the work, tearing up floorboards, patching walls, and trying to make sense of the chaotic wiring. The silence of the house during the day was almost peaceful, interrupted only by the sound of tools and the occasional groan of the old wood shifting. But the nights were a different story. The first night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps overhead. They were slow, deliberate, and heavy, like someone was pacing back and forth. I told myself it was the old house settling. It had to be. The second night, the whisper started. Faint at first, just on the edge of hearing. I couldn't make out the words, but they seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. By the end of the first week, I'd begun to notice something strange about the attic. The door was locked, and none of the keys we found fit. It wasn't just that it was locked, it felt wrong. The air around it was colder, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was standing on the other side listening. The whispers grew louder each night, and I began to notice other things. Objects weren't where I'd left them. Doors I knew I'd closed were wide open when I turned around. Once, I woke up to find a set of dusty footprints leading from the staircase to the foot of my bed and nowhere else. I tried to ignore it, to focus on the work. But the harder I tried, the worse it got. It was during one of my late-night attempts to avoid sleeping that I found it. A small leather-bound diary hidden in a false drawer of the library desk. The pages were brittle, the handwriting neat but frantic. The entries were written by someone who had lived in the house long before me. They spoke of loneliness, of anger, and of rituals performed in the attic to bring someone or something back. The last entry chilled me to the bone. He will return. I just need one more. I slammed the book shut, my hands shaking. For the first time since arriving, I felt a deep, gnawing fear. I couldn't ignore the attic any longer. Armed with a crowbar, I forced the door open. The room beyond was stifling, the air thick with dust and something heavier, something that made it hard to breathe. In the center of the room was a single wooden chair, facing a large, cracked mirror. The walls were covered in symbols, crudely carved into the wood. And then there was a smell, something sweet and rotting. I stepped closer to the mirror, and that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was my reflection. But as I moved, it didn't. The figure in the mirror was pale, with hollow eyes and a twisted grin that seemed to stretch far beyond what was natural. It raised a hand, and I felt cold fingers brush against my shoulder. I spun around, but the room was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was gone, but the symbols on the wall seemed to glow faintly, pulsing like they were alive. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The whispers were louder than ever, and the footsteps weren't just above me. They were in the hallway, outside my door. By dawn, I'd made up my mind. I packed what little I could carry and left the rest behind. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The house stood there, silent and still, but I swear I saw someone standing in the attic window, watching me leave. I never went back. I couldn't. The house was sold at auction a year later, but I've never been able to find out who bought it or what happened to them. Sometimes, late at night, I wake up to the sound of whispers. They're faint, almost inaudible, but they're there. And every so often, I see something out of the corner of my eye, a pale face, a hollow gaze, watching, waiting. I've always loved the outdoors. There's something about the quiet of the forest, the way the air smells of pine and earth, that's always made me feel at peace. That's why the idea of renting a remote lodge for a weekend getaway seemed perfect. A chance to escape the noise of the city and reconnect with nature. But some places are quiet for a reason. The lodge was about 3 hours from the city, tucked deep in a forest that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. The directions were simple enough, but as I got closer, the road narrowed, turning from asphalt to gravel and then to dirt. The trees pressed in on either side, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. By the time I reaching the lodge, the sun was beginning to set. The building was rustic, almost charming, with a sloping roof and a wraparound porch. It looked like something out of a postcard, at least from the outside. Inside, the lodge was simple but comfortable. The main room had a stone fireplace, a worn leather couch, and a bookshelf filled with old paperbacks. There was no Wi-Fi, no television, not even cell service. Just the sounds of the forest and the crackle of the fire I built to chase away the chill. The first few hours were peaceful. I read a little, cooked a simple meal, and went to bed early, exhausted from the drive. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had pulled me from sleep. The room was dark, the only light coming from the dying embers in the fireplace. Then I heard it, a faint tapping sound, like someone was gently knocking on the window. The lodge had only one bedroom, and the window was right next to the bed. I lay there, heart pounding, trying to convince myself it was just a branch or an animal. But the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic. Gathering my courage, I rolled over and peeked out through the curtain. Nothing, just darkness and the faint outline of the trees. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been my imagination. I spent the day hiking, exploring the trails that wound through the forest. It was beautiful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every so often, I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. As I made my way back to the lodge, I found something strange. Near the edge of the property, there was a clearing with an old, crumbling stone well. It wasn't on the map, and it looked like it hadn't been used in decades. Curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped closer. The air around the well was colder, and as I peered into the darkness, I thought I heard something, a faint whisper, like a voice carried on the wind. I didn't stick around to investigate. That night, the tapping came again, louder this time. It wasn't just at the bedroom window. It was at every window. The sound moved from one to the next, circling the lodge. I turned on every light, hoping to scare off whatever animal was responsible. But when I looked outside, the clearing around the lodge was empty. Then the knocking stopped and the whispers began. They were faint at first, like the ones I'd heard near the well. But as the minutes passed, they grew louder, more insistent. I couldn't make out the words, but there was an urgency to them, a desperate, pleading tone. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself it was just the wind. But then I heard footsteps on the porch. The front door rattled, like someone was trying to handle. My heart was in my throat as I grabbed the fire poker and crept toward the door. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaking. The rattling stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, from the other side of the door, I heard a voice. It was soft, almost a whisper, and it sounded wrong, like someone trying to mimic a human voice, but not quite getting it right. "Let me in," it said. I froze. Every instinct in my body screamed at me not to open the door, not to let it in. The voice came again, louder this time, more insistent. "Please, I'm cold." I backed away, gripping the fire poker like it was the only thing keeping me alive. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed by the fireplace, every light in the lodge blazing. The whispers and footsteps continued through the night, circling the lodge, stopping occasionally at the windows. By dawn, the sound stopped. The forest was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavy, unnatural. I packed my things and left without looking back. A week later, I got curious. I looked up the lodge online, trying to find out more about the property. That's when I found the news articles. Years ago, a family had stayed there. They disappeared without a trace, their cars still parked outside, their belongings untouched. The only clue was a set of footprints leading from the lodge to the old stone well. I haven't been back to the forest since. Sometimes, though, when I'm lying in bed at night, I hear faint whispers outside my window, and I wonder if I brought something back with me. I've always loved hotels. There's something exciting about staying in a new place, surrounded by strangers, where every room holds a story you'll never know. But after what happened in that hotel, I'll never look at them the same way again. It was a business trip, a last-minute assignment that left me scrambling to find a place to stay. The hotel wasn't fancy, just a modest, slightly outdated building on the edge of town. It had the basics. Clean rooms, a small lobby, and a vaguely unsettling quiet that I didn't think much about at the time. I checked in late, tired from the drive, and the receptionist handed me a key to room 303. The elevator ride up was uneventful, though I couldn't help noticing how dim the lights were in the hallway. It felt like the bulbs were struggling to stay alive, flickering faintly as I made my way to my room. Room 303 was at the very end of the hall. The door looked like every other door, but as I slid the key into the lock, a strange feeling washed over me. It was subtle, just a flicker of unease, like I was intruding somewhere I didn't belong. The room itself was ordinary. A bed, a small desk, a television, and a window with heavy curtains. But it was cold, colder than the rest of the hotel. I fiddled with the thermostat, but it didn't seem to make a difference. I chalked it up to an old building with lousy heating, unpacked my things, and climbed into bed, eager for sleep. Sometime around 2 a.m., I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The room was silent, the kind of silence that felt oppressive, like even the air was holding its breath. Then I noticed a shadow. It was on the wall opposite the bed, a vague, human-like shape cast by the faint glow of the streetlight outside. I thought it was just my imagination until it moved. It didn't walk or shift like a normal shadow. It rippled, stretching and shrinking, almost as if it were trying to pull itself free from the wall. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The shadow seemed to notice me, or at least that's what it felt like. It stopped moving, and for a long, agonizing moment, it just lingered there, motionless. Then, slowly, it slid across the wall and disappeared into the corner. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I went to the front desk. I didn't want to sound like a lunatic, so I casually asked the receptionist if the hotel had ever had issues with electrical wiring or strange drafts. She looked at me with a tight, uncomfortable smile. "Not that I know of," she said, but there was something in her tone that made me think she wasn't telling the whole truth. I spent the day in meetings, but I couldn't focus. My thoughts kept drifting back to the shadow, the way it moved, the oppressive cold of the room. When I returned to the hotel that evening, I noticed something strange. The hallway leading to room 303 felt longer. The dim light seemed even dimmer, and the air was heavy, almost suffocating. I was determined to get some sleep, so I left the television on for background noise and kept the bedside lamp lit. It didn't help. Around midnight, the cold returned, sharper this time, like it was seeping into my bones. Then I heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from the far corner of the room. It started softly, like nails running gently along the wall, but it grew louder, more frantic. I turned toward the sound, and that's when I saw it. The shadow was back, but this time it wasn't on the wall. It was standing in the corner, darker than the surrounding room, a void in the shape of a person. I wanted to move, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. All I could do was watch as the shadow shifted, its form rippling like smoke. And then it stepped closer. Next morning, I packed my things and went straight to the front desk, determined to check out early. As I handed the key back, I hesitated. "Has anyone ever reported anything strange about room 303? I asked. The receptionist's smile faltered. She glanced over her shoulder, then leaned in closer. "There is no room 303, she whispered. I stared at her, confused. "What are you talking about?" "I stayed there last night." Her expression turned pale. Room 303 was sealed off years ago. There was an incident. No one's supposed to go in there. My stomach dropped. I insisted she come with me to check, to prove that I wasn't crazy. When we reached the end of the hallway, my heart stopped. There was no door. Where room 303 should have been was just a blank wall, the faint outline of where a door might have once been visible under layers of faded paint. I don't know what I stayed in that night, but I'll never forget the feeling of that shadow watching me, waiting. I avoid hotels now, and sometimes, late at night, I feel the same cold creeping into my room, and I know the shadow hasn't forgotten me. It's just waiting for the right time to return. Was never one for antiques. They always seemed to carry a weight with them, like they had soaked up too much of the past to be entirely free of it. But when a distant family member passed and left me their estate, I didn't have much choice but to deal with the overwhelming collection of relics they'd amassed over the years. The estate was enormous, an old Gothic-style mansion that seemed to sag under the weight of its own history. Walking through its halls felt like stepping back in time. Everything was preserved so perfectly it was almost unsettling. But there was one piece that stood out from the moment I saw it, a tall, ornate mirror in the sitting room. The mirror was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Its frame was carved from dark wood, intricate patterns of twisting vines, and what looked like faces, human and animal, frozen mid-scream. The glass was slightly warped, giving everything reflected a faintly distorted look. The lawyer handling the estate told me the mirror had been there for over a century. Family legend says it was brought over from Europe, she said with a shrug. Some say it's cursed. I laughed it off at the time. I didn't believe in curses. But from the moment I first looked into that mirror, I felt wrong. It wasn't anything obvious, just a faint unease that crept up my spine every time I passed by it. The reflection always seemed darker than it should have been, as if the room behind me wasn't quite the same as the one I was standing in. I decided to stay at the estate while I sorted through the belongings, thinking it would be easier than driving back and forth every day. The first night was quiet enough, though the house groaned and creaked like an old ship at sea. Sometime after midnight, I woke up. The air in the room was freezing, and I could hear faint whispers coming from somewhere downstairs. They were soft, almost too quiet to make out, but they were there. I told myself it was just the wind or the old pipes, but when I stepped into the hallway, the whispers grew louder. They seemed to be coming from the sitting room. And the mirror. The sitting room was dark, but the moonlight streaming through the window lit up the mirror. I could see my reflection standing in the doorway, but something about it was wrong. It wasn't just me in the reflection. Behind me, in the shadows, I could make out faint shapes. They were indistinct, like smudges of darkness, but they moved. Slowly, deliberately, toward the figure that was supposed to be me. I turned around, heart racing, but the room was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the shapes were gone, but my reflection wasn't quite right. My face seemed off, my expression colder, the eyes darker. I backed out of the room and didn't go back until morning. The next day, I decided to dig through the estate records, hoping to learn more about the mirror. I found an old journal tucked away in a desk drawer, written by one of the house's previous owners. The entries grew increasingly frantic as they progressed. The writer spoke of seeing things in the mirror that shouldn't have been there, shadows, figures, and sometimes people they recognized. One entry stood out. The mirror shows what it wants me to see, but it lies. I can't trust it, and now it's watching me when I'm not looking. The last page was smeared with ink, the words barely legible. If you're reading this, don't look into it. Don't let it see you. I didn't want to stay another night, but it was late by the time I finished packing some of the smaller items to take back with me. I told myself I'd sleep for a few hours and leave first thing in the morning. That night, the whispers returned, louder this time. They weren't coming from the pipes or the wind. They were coming from the mirror. I could hear them clearly now, overlapping voices speaking in a language I didn't understand. And then I heard my name. I froze, staring at the bedroom door. Slowly, as if compelled by some unseen force, I got out of bed and walked toward the sitting room. The mirror was glowing faintly, the warped glass rippling like water. My reflection was waiting for me, but it wasn't mirroring my movements. It smiled. I don't remember much after that. The next thing I knew, I was outside, standing in the driveway with the keys to my car clutched in my hand. The house loomed behind me, silent and still, but I could feel it watching me. I drove straight home, leaving everything behind. The estate remains unsold. No one wants it, not even for free. I've tried to forget about the mirror, but sometimes, when I pass by a reflective surface, I catch a glimpse of something that shouldn't be there. And every so often, I wake up in the middle of the night, certain I hear whispers calling my name. When I moved out of my parents' house, I thought I was ready for independence. I found a cheap apartment in an older building downtown, a small one-bedroom with creaky floors and ancient pipes. The rent was low, the location was decent, and I was excited to make it my own. The landlord had been vague about the building's history when I asked. "It's just an old place," he said with a dismissive wave. "Been around for decades. You'll be fine." But from the moment I stepped inside, the apartment didn't feel fine. At first, it was little things. Lights flickering, faucets dripping, doors creaking open when I swore I'd close them. I blamed it on the age of the building. Old places have quirks, right? But then I started hearing noises at night, soft footsteps in the hallway, faint whispers just on the edge of hearing. I'd get up to check, but the apartment would be empty. One night, I heard something even stranger, the sound of breathing. It wasn't mine. It came from the corner of my bedroom, where the shadows always seemed a little too dark. A week after moving in, I decided to tackle the one part of the apartment I'd been avoiding, the closet in the bedroom. It was an old, heavy thing with a warped wooden door that didn't quite close all the way. I don't know why it unsettled me. Maybe it was the way it seemed darker inside than the rest of the room, or how the air around it felt colder. But I figured I was just being silly and decided to finally unpack the last of my things. When I opened the closet door, the first thing I noticed was the smell. It wasn't overwhelming, just faint and musty, like old wood and dampness. The closet was empty except for a small trapdoor in the floor. Curiosity got the better of me, and I pried it open. Below was a crawl space, dark and narrow, with a faint metallic smell that made my stomach turn. That night, the breathing in the corner was louder. I started to notice more things. Food went missing from the fridge. Objects I'd left on the counter would show up in different places. And then there were the notes. At first, they were small, almost innocuous. A sticky note on the fridge with the word hello scrawled in shaky handwriting. Another one on my bathroom mirror that said nice place. I thought it was some sort of prank. Maybe someone had a spare key, or the landlord was letting himself in. I changed the locks, but the notes kept coming. One morning, I found a note on my nightstand. It wasn't like the others. It was longer, written in that same shaky hand. Thanks for letting me stay. I've been here longer than you, but I'll try to keep out of your way. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, every creak of the building setting my nerves on edge. Around 3 a.m., I heard the breathing again. But this time, it wasn't coming from the corner. It was right next to me. I turned on the light, heart pounding, but the room was empty. That's when I noticed the closet door was open, just a crack. Something moved inside. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, aiming it toward the closet. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating a figure crouched in the shadows. It wasn't human, at least not entirely. Its limbs were too long, its skin pale and stretched tight over bones. Its face was a twisted mockery of humanity, with hollow eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. It smiled at me, revealing teeth that were far too sharp. I bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind me. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely hold my phone as I called the police. By the time they arrived, the thing was gone. The officers searched the apartment and found nothing, except for the crawl space under the closet. When they opened it, the smell hit us first, a sickly, rotting stench that made my stomach churn. Inside, they found old blankets, empty food wrappers, and dozens of notes scrawled in the same shaky handwriting. Most of them were meaningless gibberish, but a few stood out. Don't look at me. I'll be quiet. This is my home too. The officers told me it was likely just a squatter, but I knew better. Whatever had been living there wasn't human. I moved out the next day, breaking my lease and leaving behind everything I couldn't carry. I haven't lived alone since, and sometimes, late at night, I wake up to the sound of breathing, faint and steady, coming from a corner of the room, and I wonder if it ever really left.